E ao chegarmos à nossa última palestra,
And as we are now having our last presentations,
que trata de um tema tão importante e atual,
which is dealing about such an important topic and current topic,
te pedimos uma bênção especial
we ask you for a special blessing
para que todo esse aprendizado
that all this that we are learning
possa ficar claro na nossa mente
may be clear in our minds,
e também faça parte da nossa prática.
and that it may become part of our practice.
Esteja com Lara nesse momento,
Please be with Lara at this moment.
em nome de Jesus. Amém.
In the name of Jesus, amen. Sorry, just a second, need to select the right channel. Agora sim. Hello, everyone. It's really good to be here with you. And this is our last study of this camp meeting. I believe all of us have been really blessed by these studies. So our study yesterday, we saw the role of political parties as the gatekeepers of democracy. So political parties, they have established measures, established means to prevent the downfall of democracies. And we ended our presentation yesterday by asking, why has this filter function failed to prevent the rise of autocracies around the world? We have to be clear that there's always going to be a tension between the role of filtering and the role of selecting a leader which represents the interests of the people. This is but natural because there's no perfect system, and you will always have to look for a balance. Because it's when people associate themselves to a authoritarian leader, that established politicians need to fulfill their role as the gatekeepers of democracy. And they need to point out the danger of this. They need to show the people what is at stake. Or, as we read yesterday, what they need to do is they need to isolate that candidate and distance themselves so that this person doesn't rise to power in the first place. But what we can observe today is a very weak compromise which is being made in regards to safeguarding democracy. And this goes way beyond just being supportive of authoritarian candidates. There's this wrong concept, this wrong idea that politicians need just to stick to the Constitution. If they just stick strongly to the Constitution, then democracy will be just safe. It's not that easy. Because you can actually you can profess to follow the law, and you can actually be against its spirit. You can be in agreement with the letter of the law and be against its spirit. We have been studying this topic within the movement about the originalist concept, and we know that it goes exactly against that idea. So what the authors of the book consider as essential in order to safeguard democracy are just these very rules which are not written. So it's about the non-written rules which are there to protect democracy, and they highlight two of them. So what are these non-written rules? Let's have a look at quote number 7. So quote 7, norms are more than personal dispositions. They are not simply based on the good character of political leaders, but are shared codes of conduct in a particular community or society, accepted, respected, and enforced by its members. As they are not written down, they are often difficult to see, especially if they are working well. This can mislead us to believing that they are not necessary. However, nothing could be further from the truth. Like oxygen or drinking water, the importance of a norm is quickly revealed by its absence. When norms are robust, violations trigger expressions of disapproval, ranging from nodding and jeering to public criticism and complete isolation. And politicians who don't respect norms pay the price. Unwritten rules are everywhere in US politics, from the operations of the Senate and the Electoral College to the format of presidential press conferences. However, two norms stand out as fundamental to the functioning of a democracy: mutual tolerance and institutional reserve. So unwritten rules have been everywhere in the American political system since its foundation. So there's no written law that establishes these rules, and they are not detailed within the Constitution. But there's a consensus that it is necessary to follow these rules, and when they're not followed, then this will not go unnoticed. The disobedience to these rules generates resistance. So unwritten rules are everywhere. So let us look at a social level to then look at the political realm. So let's consider public transportation, and those seats reserved for the elderly or which, if they are all occupied, let us imagine there's another elderly person or pregnant person or someone with a child enters the transport. It's an unwritten rule. It's commonly expected that someone occupying a common seat stands up and gives place to that person. I don't know how it's being handled in other countries, but this is here where I live. It's just a given. And even if there is no written rule about this, if that person wouldn't have gotten up to give place, the person wouldn't suffer any legal consequences. It's still something that's being expected, and it would be very strange if someone would not get up and give place. So the social system as well as the political system is full of these unwritten rules. One of these unwritten rules is the limitation to two presidential periods, terms. Thank you. It used to be an unwritten rule which was being followed along many decades, which began back then with George Washington. And it used to be an unwritten rule which was well respected until we got to Roosevelt in 1940, and when he was re-elected for a third term. Actually, he was entering the fourth term already. And it was only due to this situation that it became necessary to turn it into a written rule, and that became the 26th Amendment. But this only happened in 1951. That's quite recent. So these norms may be very small and seemingly insignificant things, but they can also be general things, understandings. For example, in regard to the press, it's it is common, or it's expected that one waves back at the press and the journalists when you are entering the plane. Um, it's seemingly insignificant, but it has its um, but it be could you repeat? Pode repetir? So this would be an insignificant norm, but there are others which are much more important, like, for example, to hold regular press conferences where all journalists are invited. And all or both of these rules are being followed all over the years. This has been just normal. But Trump was responsible for breaking with this rule, and he selectively excluded New York Times journalists and CNN and LA, the Los Angeles Times. And before that, this rule had only been broken by President Nixon. And he barred the Washington Post right after the Watergate scandal. Another unwritten rule is that a president should not be lying in public. So if they prefer not to answer a question, they are given a guideline, or they are oriented. So they're being advised to be evasive or to change the topic, subject, but never should be lying directly. So it's no secret to anyone that Trump broke with this rule numerous times. So there's a political fact-checking website, and it classified Trump's what he said. So what they said is that 74% of his public statements are mostly false, or just outright lies. So Trump is well known as a serial violator of unwritten norms. But let us talk about these two unwritten rules, which the authors highlight as being essential. So this is mutual tolerance and institutional reserve, and they are closely linked together. So mutual tolerance is about realizing that your political opponents are not your enemies. And it means to accept that within the institutional rules, these opponents have a right to exist, to compete for power, and to govern. In being legitimate opponents, they are not to be seen as rivals. They are not to be treated as traitors or as enemies or yeah. So it's quite easy to understand the importance of these rules. But at the same time, we realize how these unwritten rules are corroding around the world. And this is all being favored by a polarized scenario. So the second important rule, that is the, how do you call it, institutional reserve. So it's a self-control and a restraint in the use of power. So that means that it means that you are not allowed to use your institutional prerogatives to its limit. Even though you have the legal right to go to the very limit of your power, because there's nothing in the Constitution that forbids you. So reservation or institutional reserve needs to limit your actions. In order to respect and to grant the autonomy of each institution. So one example would be the privilege of the president to select the candidates for the Supreme Court. Such as in countries where the number of seats in a Supreme Court is not specifically defined. Usually the presidents, they would respect the idea that that institution is meant to be independent. And even this could create a certain resistance, but it is an alternative for authoritarians. So it's almost a cliche idea used by authoritarians like Chavez, Bukele, and Orban. And once again, it was Roosevelt in 1937 who tried to instrumentalize the Supreme Court for himself. But this resulted in a very strong resistance within their own ranks, that is, Republicans as well as Democrats. But disrespecting institutional reserve can be coming from any side. For example, a Congress that maintains the majority can just bar or just turn the presidential role dysfunctional, sorry. And they can just bar the indications for Supreme Court justices, and they can also use impeachment as a political tool. And then we enter the field of the hard play, the hard rules of following the Constitution. And institutions end up becoming weapons in order to eliminate your political opponents. And the political scenario, the political game, becomes a battlefield. So the next quote we're going to read is going to explain further the relation between these two norms. That would be quote number 8. Sorry. Mutual tolerance and institutional reserve are closely related. Sometimes they reinforce each other. Politicians are more prone to moderation when they accept each other as legitimate rivals, and those who don't view opponents up as subversives will be less tempted to resort to violations of the norm to keep them out of power. Acts of reservation, for example, a Republican-controlled Senate approving the nomination of a Democratic president to the Supreme Court, will reinforce each party's beliefs that the other side is tolerable, promoting a virtuous cycle. However, the opposite can also happen. The erosion of mutual tolerance can motivate politicians to deploy the institutional powers as widely as possible without being punished. When parties see each other as mortal enemies, the stakes increase dramatically. Losing ceases to be a routine and accepted part of the political process and instead becomes a total catastrophe. When the inferred cost of losing is high enough, politicians will be tempted to abandon the institutional reserve. Acts of constitutional brinkmanship can then, in turn, further undermine mutual tolerance, reinforcing the belief that our rivals pose a dangerous threat. The result is politics without guardrails. The authors, they describe these unwritten rules as flexible guardrails. So if we look at the Obama's nomination in 2016 and Trump's subsequent victory, if we better understand unwritten rules, then we realize that what happened in 2016 was only the tip of the iceberg. Even before Obama came to power, everything that he represented was already not being tolerated by the great majority of the Republican electorate. And we know these at the Tea Party movement and the birth movement. So what they did, they questioned Obama's legitimacy and even his nationality. So when he came to power, he is confronting a Republican Party that is very resistant. And they are totally willing to make him a president to serve only one term. These are the very words of Mitch McConnell. He was the minority leader back then. So the resistance of the opposition was so great that back in 2013, that of the 168 rejected indications for the Senate, almost half of them, 82, happened during the term of Obama. And this is when Republicans, they finally managed to hold the majority of the Senate. Sorry, the Democrats, they voted to você pode repetir? Eles votaram? So they voted to strike down all these all the obstructions that had been imposed by the Republican Party in order to stop these indications. And this became known as a very drastic move. It's called the nuclear option. Yeah. So these unwritten norms, they had already become very weak. And even Obama himself, he began to abandon institutional reserve. By executive orders, unilateral executive orders. And he did this in order to bypass a very dysfunctional Senate, in his words. That's not the best way to deal with it. But it's very hard to decide what to do in an environment where your opponents don't leave you any option. But when this becomes like a hardball game, like without rules, and if your answer is to these authoritarian tendencies that you play even harder, your adversaries, they can use this as a justification, as an argument. To become even more aggressively opposed and to increase hostilities. All this resistance that we are speaking about did not even begin with the Obama administration. So it was during the Clinton administration that there was a significant increase of obstruction. And this is a term which becomes known as a politically motivated impeachment. So when the Bush administration comes, the Democrats, on their part, they also play hard. So it became clearer that political parties they were not willing to work together any longer. So the authors of this book, they point out one person which is very significant in this whole scenario. His name is Newt Gingrich, and he began his political rise in 1978. And he became a Speaker of the House in 1995. So among his contributions to North American politics, he's known as having contributed to educate a new generation of Republican politicians. So we are going to read a brief quote that is 11, quote number 11. In the early 1990s, Gingrich and his team distributed memos to Republican candidates instructing them to use certain negative words to describe Democrats, including pathetic, sick, bizarre, betray, anti-flag, anti-family, and traitors. It was the beginning of a seismic shift in American politics. So what Gingrich did, he directly attacked mutual tolerance. And even though there was a certain resistance against him initially at the beginning, the fruits of his work are visible, are clear. Instead of disrespect and violence and violent speech, these things have increased since then. And these things have gained much more space within politics, and maybe they had their highest point during the Trump administration. But this new strategy of intolerance, which was introduced by Newt Gingrich, he actually just took advantage of a polarization which is already in the process of happening. And it just gave a political and a violent voice to a process which was already happening. Like, I'd like us to think what was happening in this period just before. Let us think what happened in the years before this time. Well, what could cause this polarization? I'm just putting here the key dates, 1964, 1965. So what do these dates mean? They are, that's the time of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So on one hand, this contributed to the democratic process within the population, but it also helped to polarize the country. And to make this clear, we're going to read a quote, that our last longer quote, and I would ask you to try to pay attention to the details. That would be quote number 10. The norms sustaining our political system rested to a considerable degree on racial exclusion. The stability of the period between the end of Reconstruction and the 1980s was rooted in an original sin. The Compromise of 1877 and its aftermath, which permitted the de-democratization of the South and the consolidation of Jim Crow. Racial exclusion contributed directly to the partisan civility and cooperation that came to characterize 20th century American politics. The Solid South emerged as a powerful conservative force within the Democratic Party, simultaneously vetoing civil rights and serving as a bridge to Republicans. Southern Democrats' ideological proximity to conservative Republicans reduced polarization and facilitated bipartisanship. But it did so at the great cost of keeping civil rights and America's full democratization off the political agenda. America's democratic norms then were born in a context of exclusion. As long as the political community was restricted largely to whites, Democrats and Republicans had much in common. Neither party was likely to view the other as an existential threat. The process of racial inclusion that began after World War II and culminated in the 1964 Civil Rights Act and 1965 Voting Rights Act would, at long last, fully democratize the United States. But it would also polarize it, posing the greatest challenge to established forms of mutual toleration and forbearance since Reconstruction. And it is at this point that this seemingly beautiful concept of unwritten norms that these guardrails of democracy, they turn out not to be so nice at all. So it seems to make logic sense. It seems to be basic. To think that politicians, that they should be respecting each other, that they should be respecting the institutions. And this is why it's so sad that something seemingly so basic, so fundamental, only began to work properly in the context and the history of segregation. And this is something that must not be hidden or omitted. But what I would like us to focus on here when we talk about subverting a democracy, things are not so simple, so easy. So we're not simply talking about an authoritarian figure. Let's say a person that needs to conquer the emotions and passions of the majority. In order to come to power, and then bye-bye democracy. It's not like this that it's supposed to happen. We have an entire political democratic system when it's functional that is supposed to function in many ways in order to prevent the rise of authoritarian leaders. Pode concluir. Because in the 21st century, outsider politicians or outsider autocrats, they don't come to power without the support of leaders from within, which is not supposed to take place in the first place. And there's a basic concept in the context of elections that we are supposed to have a very close look at the candidate's agenda, his proposals. So that we can actually demand that he fulfills what he promised, or we can check on what he promised. But when we understand what democracy actually is, independently of the political party or the political position that the candidate is voted for. All political candidates, they have the duty to seek the protection of the democracy, to protect democracy. So if you take it, your free decision to become a candidate, to subvert or to weaken democracy should not be an option at all. So unfortunately, lately, politicians, they have reflected just this polarized situation on this world. Instead of understanding their role as being filters and guardians of democracy. So in our study here, we had a closer look at the role of political parties and the political players. Within this context of crisis and downfall of democracies. But of course, there are other components that play a role, that are at stake. Such as the authors call them, they call them, is it referees or something like that? Yeah, like a referee in a sports game. So this refers to the legal, the legislative, the national intelligence, and also the IRA, or the financial institution of the government. Desculpa, aqui deu uma congelada. Can you repeat? Sorry, I think eu tenho um problema com a conexão. If you could repeat just once more again, please. Okay, sorry. So the judiciary is also it also plays this role of being a referee. So they have this role of being neutral referees. They're there to point out, to denounce political abuse and to prevent fraud in general. This can be understood as a challenge. But it also turns out to be an opportunity for future authoritarians. Because if he manages to get control of these institutions, then he will be protected in the future. He ends up protecting his own government against future investigation and criminal process. And he can do this by dismissing key figures and replacing them with his own allied people. But he can also use other means like forcing them out of position by threats or by all sorts of means. And as a drastic move, he can also destroy judicial courts and recreate new ones. Trump, he didn't care to be subtle about his tendencies. In the very first weeks of his government, he tried to assure the loyalty of the FBI director. And he tried to protect himself against the ongoing investigations in regard to Russia. And since he was not successful he ended up firing that FBI director in 2017. And he was being opposed in this case by Republicans and Democrats. And he was unable to replace this position with someone that would be allied or aligned with him. Pode repetir? So apart from these so-called referees, other players or positions that are under attack are business people that are funding and financing free press. Okay, nice. What else? And cultural key figures. And if they are not successful in buying their sympathy, they will be persecuted in a subtle way. So there might be legal processes that are being made against them, and processos, or maybe they're being charged in an unrightful way, taxes. They may be fined with very high fines, or they can be charged for some disrespecting some rule. And it's not something that's only weakening or attacking these individuals. But it contributes to silence opposition in general, because they will be afraid of retribution. So each one of these players, they play a key role in opposing, in the opposition of a government. And they also serve to indicate if a political leader has authoritarian tendencies. So once we better understand how this whole dynamics functions, we understand that the downfall of a democracy is not a simple process, and it's not unavoidable. So there are organs and there are institutions that are just there to prevent this from happening. And it is our duty to be well informed about this. And it's our duty to and it's our duty to make sure that this protection mechanism actually functions and works. Because fighting for democracy means also fighting for equality. We're going to end this presentation by quoting a political scientist, Daniela Allen. That would be quote number 14. The simple fact of the matter is that the world has never built a multi-ethnic democracy in which no particular ethnic group is the majority, and where political equality, social equality, and economies that empower have been achieved. Once again, we can draw this lesson from the US past history, where these unwritten rules, they used to work very nicely. But the reason for them to work so nicely was they had a very ugly segregational or racist background. And these norms, they just never worked out within a fully democratic equal system. And we believe in our prophetic message that a fully equal and functional system will never be the reality on this earth. Things will just become worse and crises will increase. And with the downfall of democracies, equality also will fall. And this is why equality, more than ever, needs to be written on our flags, on our banners. Our banner that we hold as a movement and also as individuals. Shall we end with a prayer? Dear God of love, we thank you for the opportunity of coming together at this camp meeting. To be able to learn more about you. And to begin this week with well nurtured. As well as a lot to think about during this week. Help us to strengthen ourselves that we may become strong in holding up this banner of yours. The banner of equality. In the name of Jesus we pray, amen.
Bom, nossa campal está chegando ao fim.
Well, our